Alright fellas, now we're into the real meat of the iceberg. Most of the games from here on out will be disturbing, messed up, or wicked offensive. So, fair warning for that. Also, some of these games, especially the ones lower down, don't exactly have the most information available on them, so feel free to fill in any blanks or anything I mess up down in the comments. As a very quick notice before we get started, a third version of this iceberg has been released by Annie, the creator of the iceberg, which I will be moving to starting in the next video. In the complete version of this iceberg, I will retroactively add any new entries to earlier tiers. As usual, red is for Zorn games, green is for mods and fan games, orange is for extremist games, and purple is for Zorn games with an all ages release. We're now moving into tier 4. This is the likely point where the average person is going to have never heard of most of these games. Bunker 16 has you exploring an old haunted bunker. You entered it to take shelter from a storm and unlocked behind you, leaving you to find a way out. You collect notes and avoid paranormal stuff like guys coming out of the walls, eventually escaping the bunker to be met with this. The game is fairly short, being about 30 minutes long. I See You has you waking up in an empty, possibly abandoned hospital. Over the course of the game, the hospital becomes seemingly a living being, with the walls, doors, and more turning into flesh, mouths, and eyes. At the very end of the game, it opens a bunch of tabs on your real-life browser, which talk directly to you, stating, "Found you." Later on, even if you've uninstalled the game, you continue to get pop-ups on your computer saying things like, "I'll be watching forever." Dungeon Nightmares was originally released in 2014 as a mobile exclusive. The game has you going to sleep and exploring a dungeon in a nightmare. You continue the cycle of falling asleep and exploring to progress the game. The original is pretty much what you'd expect from a 2014 mobile game, but the sequel, Dungeon Nightmares 2: The Memory, has much more than its predecessor. It was released on Steam in 2015 and has a proper story, along with new monsters and overall upgraded gameplay. There's also a third game that was or is in development, Dungeon Nightmares 3, which is currently in early access on Steam. Wrapping back to the story of Dungeon Nightmares 2, depending on what you manage to scavenge up over the course of the game, two endings are possible. One has you stuck in a hellish prison for eternity, and the other has you coming across a house that the third game takes place in. Mario, the Music Box, is an RPG Maker fan game that I've seen perfectly described as Mario being thrown into a game like Corpse Party or The Witch's House, both of which we've gone over already. In the game, Mario is trapped in an old abandoned house and has to find a way out, or else he's for sure gonna kick the bucket. Mario collects journal notes to uncover some of the mysteries, and writes in his own journal as well for any major events. The game has a sequel, DLC, a remaster, and a final unreleased DLC named Delirium. As the story isn't fully finished, I'm not going to go into it any more than that. Oh, and the game is completely free by the way, so if you want to try it, it's there. Briefly combing over the most obvious disturbing part of the game, there's like a full hour or more worth of possible deaths, with special dialogue and cutscenes showing graphic depictions of dead Mario. Lost in Vivo is a 2018 game that primarily uses claustrophobia for its scares. The game begins with a nice calm walk with your dog, when a storm comes and your dog is swept into the sewers. You rush to the entrance to find him, and end up having to trek through all sorts of different creepy places, such as a testing lab, hospital, subway, and a mine. The game has multiple endings, ranging from you finding your dog and becoming a better person because of the journey, to summoning an eldritch creature in the sewers that completely destroys reality as you know it. Releasing in 2017 and being published by New Blood Interactive, Faith the Unholy Trinity has you wandering a forest with pretty much nothing but a crucifix, which you can use to dispel anything that decides to kill you. The game features super retro graphics, reminiscent of old Atari games. The game's plot has you trying to conduct an exorcism, which has already failed once, so that you can put an end to things properly. The exorcism is to be done on a young woman named Amy. Upon reaching her house, she escapes and you grab a rifle with one shot. Depending on what you shoot, 5 different endings are possible. In one, you can shoot Amy, but this simply results in you getting arrested for murder. You can also shoot a man you come across, which will result in his son killing you as you leave. You can shoot a corpse you find in the woods, which results in you being surrounded and stopped by hooded figures. You then receive a note written to Amy. You can shoot a deer, which causes you to hit a deer and crash while driving away. Afterwards, you're ambushed and killed by a bunch of pissed off deer. Finally, you can keep the gun and leave, which lets you shoot a man who ambushes you in your car. Faith Chapter 2 was released in 2019, which continues the 5th ending, and Chapter 3 released on October 21st, 2022, so I won't go into spoilers as it's so recent. The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo is a primarily text-based visual novel about a kid whose buddy's uncle works for Nintendo, which is a reference to the classic declaration by dumb kids across the globe. The game has you staying the night at your friend's house, and his uncle will be arriving at midnight. A series of oddities happen around his house, which you can choose to ignore or question. Your decisions of questioning or not will affect the ending, of which there are 5 possible, with one being restricted to New Game Plus. It's revealed in the game that the uncle is some sort of eldritch creature, able to warp reality in a few different ways, which causes it to become very hungry, needing to feed on people. Some of the endings include you not catching on to anything and being consumed, trying to run from the monster and being found, or catching on that something's up and calling your mom to go home. This is a free game you can play from a browser, so check it out if you got 20 minutes to spare. Morph Girl is an FMV game from 2017 which follows a woman named Elena dealing with the loss of her wife. She goes through a monotonous routine every day and is having a hard time getting over the loss. After a while of this, the game basically rips off the movie The Ring, with a long, black-haired girl crawling out and wandering around the house. The game has different endings based on your actions in the game, but I've heard they're really not all that different. One thing I will say is that although the game is just okay, it is nice to see that FMV games aren't completely dead, as it's a fun genre. The Vanishing of Ethan Carter is a 2014 adventure game that has you solving the deaths of the Carter family. You do so by investigating bodies, piecing together clues, and using facts and logic to solve the case. You can also indulge in side activities that are required if you want the full ending. All of the deaths were the result of infighting amongst Ethan's family, having to do with sacrifices, blood rituals, and other average Wisconsin activities. Upon finding Ethan in a cave, he disappears, as you were too late to find him. If you've engaged in all of the side activities, the true ending is awarded to you, revealing that you and the entire game have been a figment of Ethan's imagination before he's killed in a house fire. Anyways, that's the super condensed version of the plot. Gameplay-wise, the game has a creepy and unnerving atmosphere, paranormal elements, and a lot of people that want this child dead. Murder House is a 2020 retro-style horror game based on PS1 games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. The game begins with a child being abducted by a mall Easter bunny. After this, the game skips forward to a news crew investigating the house of said mall Easter bunny, who is a serial killer going by the name of the Easter Ripper. The Ripper is thought to have been captured, but that's proven false when their van is ripped apart and the gate to the house is locked. Skipping forward, your crew is slaughtered by the Ripper, and you need to find a way out. You escape, confront the Ripper, shoot him with a shotgun, and zombies rise from the grave to attack him. In the full ending, the whole game is revealed to have been a movie, but the actor for the Ripper stole the outfit and skipped town, or at the least has gone missing. The final shot of the game has the Easter Bunny outfit covered in blood and in the main character's trunk. Right off the bat, the creators of this one were allegedly caught conducting inappropriate acts with minors. That's what I've heard, and I don't want to look into it further than I have to. Because of this, the mod was taken down everywhere, and I'm not in the mood to go joining random discords to maybe get a link to it. Since this is a mod for Doki Doki, which I covered earlier in a non-spoiler way, this is a fair warning that this will spoil that game, so skip ahead to the next entry if you don't want it spoiled. Alright, so essentially the mod is a continuation of the main game, with the player character having nightmares about Sayori's death, dealing with the grief that came with it. You end up at school, discussing the events of the game, and talk about how everything is just a video game and not real. The ending of this has Monica delete your game to save you from being killed. This is a brief recap, so if you'd like to see how things fully play out, I'd recommend watching a walkthrough of it, or alternatively, joining all kinds of sketchy Discord servers and asking around for it. Tell them I sent you. Revenge of the Sunfish is an absolutely, unequivocally insane game with the idea that every level is a different game. It was made in 2007 and most of the graphics were done in MS Paint, as you can probably tell. I don't exactly know how to describe this one aside from saying that it's a complete assault on the senses. So if you're into that kind of thing, it's free to download on the creator's website. Insanidate is a short game where you play as a man whose wife was murdered as he stayed late for work. He questions if he's to blame for not being there, or if the man who killed her is to blame. When the murderer is sentenced to an asylum based on a plea of insanity, you take matters into your own hands, heading to the sanatorium to ask him why, and to kill him. Upon entering, you're knocked out by a mysterious figure and placed inside a cell. You explore the asylum for a while, and I can't really give specifics on the rest as the game is in Portuguese with no English translation. In the end though, you find the man who killed your wife residing in a cell, and upon entering, the twist is that the man is you. Slide in the Woods is a very short PS1 styled horror game about a child playing on a playground in the middle of the woods, which has only one set of stairs leading up to a slide. You continually slide down and climb up, and you do so for so long that eventually it turns to night. But this doesn't stop you because you find a flashlight. After a few night slides, you find a newspaper detailing that the small town you're in has multiple missing person cases active. But this doesn't deter you from going down the iconic slide. A short while after this, you see blood leading up to the slide, as well as a body in a bag which is forced down the slide. But this also doesn't deter you from going down the gamer slide. Everything goes in a downward spiral from here, as the slide just keeps going. You emerge from the end in an otherworldly space, with a massive pyramid alongside you. You climb to the top and enter through a door that opens up. Inside, you unchain a giant pulsating meat mass and lower it into a pit in what's described as feeding them. After doing so, you're chased by an odd humanoid figure, and find yourself fleeing down a slide within the pyramid. At the end of this slide, you emerge in the park from the beginning, but with no slide or playground in sight. Alright, so this isn't about the entry, but I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about the insane and absurd games like this one. So, let's give it a shot. Funny Pizza Land is a wacky game where you explore Pizza Land in pursuit of the global media monster. You get the keys for your iconic pizza van and set off to find it. You're also given the task of finding this little creature's son. After walking around and doing some platforming, you reach a button that you press to release that creature's son, and doing so gives you extra pizza power. After your grand journey, you finally come across the global media monster and have an epic duel. Then you get married and the game ends. Funny Pizza Land 2 dropped on Steam on October 8th, 2022, so genuinely a few weeks ago as of writing this. The sequel is a point-and-click adventure game reminiscent of games like Monkey Island, rather than whatever the hell the first game is, and because of how brand new it is, I'll leave it at that. Also, I feel like explaining the plot would be a bit of a waste of time. One odd fact about Funny Pizza Land 1 is that the creator claimed it's a lost game from 2002, but there's absolutely nothing backing that up besides the creator's word, and it was most likely created in around 2011 or 2012. Notes of Obsession is a project made by a collection of Swedish game development students. That isn't necessary to know, I just thought it was cool that this is essentially a student project. The game has you playing as a young woman named Harriet. Her husband is out of town for work, so she needs to take up all the responsibilities for the time being. Upon arriving home from her son's hockey practice, she finds a music box that was sent by her husband. Using the music box causes various spooky and weird things to happen around the house, such as shadows appearing where they shouldn't, toys moving on their own, lights going out, and more. After exploring the effects of the music box around your house, you eventually encounter a legless creature which will continually crawl towards you until you lose it. Eventually, you pick up a knife and stab the creature right under your family portrait, with blood splattering on your son's picture. This heavily implies that the monster was actually your son, and you had some kind of psychotic break or were cursed from the music box. Ju-On the Grudge Haunted House Simulator is a survival horror game for the Wii made to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Ju-On series. The game has you exploring several varied locations as different members of a family that have all been cursed and hunted by Kayako Saiki, the main antagonist of the franchise. You walk around these locations in first person, using the Wiimote to control your flashlight. Each character you play as ends up dying to Kayako. The game was pretty universally dogged on by critics, so unless you're a diehard Grudge fan, this probably ain't worth playing. Sonic Dreams Collection is a perfectly normal fan game with absolutely no hidden weird secrets making fun of how weird certain parts of the Sonic fandom are. In seriousness though, Sonic Dreams Collection presents itself as a collection of lost Sonic game prototypes that get progressively weirder as you unlock more. The game starts with Make My Sonic, which is a character creator ragging on DeviantArt OCs. The second game, Eggman Origins, can only be accessed by opening a separate program that comes with the game, SegaNet, which creates a server for it, as it's supposed to be an MMO. In the game, you feed Eggman worms, which causes him to grow, and in the end, he vores you, ending the game. The third game in the collection is Sonic Movie Maker, which has you creating poses and scenes to record for a movie. The scenes presented for you to work in become increasingly gross and fetishy. The final game in the collection is My Roommate Sonic. In this minigame, you need to flirt with Sonic by tickling him, including tickling his big, stinky, sweaty feet. Once Sonic is thoroughly stimulated and aroused, you go in for a smooch, which causes his eyes to become one bulbous mass, creating a black hole that sucks you in. You're transported to a realm unlike any you've seen before, and your decapitated mass of a human body morphs into a human-proportioned Sonic, and you run, because running is your only chance of escaping this man-made hell. The game ends with Sonic shutting off the Dreamcast and you rethinking your life choices. Stray Cat Crossing is another RPG Maker horror game, which clocks in at around 2 hours long. Gameplay-wise, it's similar to most other RPG Maker games on here, having you solve puzzles, but otherwise being mainly dialogue-based. The game has you escort a crying girl named Cat home, giving her your scarf so that she doesn't catch a cold. Upon arrival, you realize that she still has your scarf, so you go inside to get it back. Upon entry, the game truly starts, requiring you to explore the house, which is divided up into 3 segments that make up the 3 acts of the game. Each segment reveals more lore and backstory that all culminates in the ending. One big event in the story is that prior to the game's events, there was a fatal car crash that Cat avoided, which is what the game is centered around. The crash involved Cat's parents, including a pregnant mother. This wraps back to present time inside the house, where you can find 2 twins in the basement, which are representations of the twins Cat's mother was carrying. I think you can piece together from that the rest of the game will be about Cat dealing with the trauma of the crash, so I'll leave it up to you if you want to play or watch the rest. My Child Lebensborn is a game about adopting and raising a child. The catch is that the game is set post-World War II, and if you didn't know, a Lebensborn child is, in the most simple definition, a child birthed by actual Nazi parents. You have the choice of adopting a girl or boy, and you need to keep them fed, entertained, clean, and more as they go through their first year of school. Because the child's biological father was a Nazi soldier, they get ostracized and bullied at school often, and you need to find a way to deal with this. In case you thought the bullying here was just going to be a bit of light razzing, some of the ways your child can be bullied include sexual assault, regular assault, or straight up attempted murder. The game has a few endings, one where your child runs away, and another where you and your adopted child leave to find a new home somewhere else in Norway. It's left ambiguous as to what happens next, with the game saying it's both possible that the 2 of you lived a better life, or that history repeats itself and the same thing happens elsewhere. Angels of Death is yet another RPG Maker horror game, with this one having your character Ray teamed up with a serial killer named Zack to escape from a big ol' hospital, with Zack and Ray making an agreement that if they escape, he'll kill her. After a whole bunch of plot, the ending is left ambiguous as to if he kills her or not. This one is similar to a few others on the Iceberg, where the anime adaptation is infinitely more popular than the original game. I don't have anything more to add to this, as I haven't seen it, I just thought that was interesting. Don't Open Your Eyes is a visual novel game where you have an oddly intimate conversation with a creature watching over you as you sleep. Throughout the game, he talks to you about his life and asks you about how you think he looks, were you to open your eyes and look at him. The game is about 30 minutes long, and throughout it, he asks you to open up your eyes at various points. If you refuse all of these, in the end, he kills you. If you do end up opening your eyes at some point, you find nothing there, just you all alone. Happy Game is a psychedelic psychological horror point-and-click game where you take control of a little boy and his nightmares. The game is pretty much entirely based on its creepy imagery, so it's kind of hard to explain, but you go through 3 different dreams, each with a different setting, from following a lost dog to bunny cannibals. The end goal of the game is to get your ball back and make the kid happy, and in the end he's awakened by his dog. Everything is Going to Be Okay is an interactive zine by Nathalie Lawhead. The game is a collection of various games, animations, poems, and more that serve as a sort of autobiography for Lawhead. The activities primarily involve trauma and dealing with bad experiences, but they aren't presented in a depressing, self-loathing kind of way, but rather a humorous, dark comedy kind of way. It would be difficult to even try summarizing this one, as it's full of abstract and very personal to the developer messages, so I'd recommend giving it a download and just exploring around for a bit. One thing I do have to mention is that during a showcase of the game, various attendees were openly hostile and rude towards the game. It got to a point where Lawhead no longer felt comfortable and had to leave the booth. They later went on to write an article detailing their harassment at the event, which called out YouTubers and streamers for promoting a culture of not accepting art games, as upon seeing games like this, they usually say something along the lines of, "What the hell? Is this devil on acid or something?" Which was a common sentiment among teenagers at the convention mentioned earlier. This article led to even more backlash and harassment, and the saga reached its absolute peak when Lawhead updated the game itself to directly include references to these events. Discover My Body is a short body horror experience where you play as a doctor observing a man's transformation into a puddle of goop. The game takes place in 2040, where society is completely socially fractured. People are longing for a genuine human connection, and the loneliest of people are partaking in something called flowering. Flowering involves allowing a fungus to do something to your body, which takes it over and begins melting it down. The end result is the patient becoming completely connected with anyone else who has undergone the process, but losing their bodies. Again though, your only mission is to observe. You watch over the patient as he goes through 3 stages of flowering, observing his outer layer, skeleton, and nervous system. Over the course of the 3 stages, you can click on a few specific points of his body to get more details on what exactly is happening to him, and in the end, he fully flowers. No One Lives Under the Lighthouse is a 2020 game with retro PS1 style graphics. For this entry I'll be talking about the director's cut, which changes the second half of the game, as I couldn't find much info on the original version. In the game you play as a replacement lighthouse keeper, moving into a lighthouse as the previous keeper disappeared. You're going to be on your own for at least a week, so you need to keep yourself sane while still doing your job. Throughout the days of the week, you're stalked and hunted by a strange creature, which eventually leads to you falling down a hole inside the lighthouse. Down there you're forced to kill the monster or jump into a pit and fucking die. If you jump, you become the monster and begin hunting the new lighthouse keeper. The game also has flashbacks revealing more of the plot, but I'll skip on that as it's a very interpretive story. Dreaming Mary is a side-scrolling RPG Maker game which contains disturbing elements hidden beneath the surface. The game's title is literal, and the game has the protagonist Mary exploring her dreams, similar to Yume Nikki. Throughout her dreams, she can come across a handful of different characters who are representations of people in her real life, such as the whimsical penguin character Gwendol, who's based on her uncle. The game has 4 different endings depending on how much you explore and uncover. Outside of her dreams, Mary's mother passed away and she now lives at home with her father. She isn't allowed to leave her house, and the only people she really ever sees on a regular basis are her maid, tutor, father, and uncle. It's no coincidence then that there are 4 dream characters who highly resemble all of them. While other dream-based games are typically based on mental health issues under the surface, such as depression, Dreaming Mary is a game about abuse. After some exploration, you can uncover what is heavily implied as Mary's father sexually abusing her, and the dreams are her way of coping with this. One portion of the game has you entering the Nightmare Realm, and in it you encounter this creature, named the Chaser, who's implied to be a representation of Mary's father. The Chaser can't be bargained with, can't be reasoned with, it doesn't feel pity, or remorse, or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead. So I kinda skimmed over off in tier 3, so this one's gonna be a bit harder to explain. Home is a non-canon fan game created for off. Before I continue with this, I wanted to mention that there are so many off fan games that they actually have their own wiki, with Home being one of many. The game takes place after the events of off, and the ending where the batter is stopped. I didn't mention it earlier, but the character who you can side with to stop the batter is a cat named the Judge, who's the protagonist of Home. Home begins with the ending of off, with the Judge walking through the purified zones. He informs you that you can reset the world by undoing the ending, and upon doing so the game shifts to the beginning of off, where instead of controlling the batter, you take control of the Judge, who is heavily present throughout the main game. After meeting the batter in both off and Home, the Judge agrees to help him. However, in Home, the Judge sees a vision of the batter purifying the zone, and goes to warn others. From here it'd be difficult to explain the plot, as it's sort of necessary to fully understand Off's plot first, so I'll leave it at that. All you've got to know is that this is a game about cats. Pokemon Nightmare Invasion is a Pokemon fan game built on the RPG Maker engine. Content-wise, it's not at all a traditional Pokemon game, instead being a survival horror game set loosely in the Pokemon world. Within the fan game, Pokemon are the products of human experimentation by the company Gene Co., who were conducting said experiments to cure Professor Oak's wife's cancer. The game has a detective named Jack investigating Azure City, which is where all of this has been taking place. Before the game began, the whole population of the city mysteriously disappeared, and Jack is going to find out why. One fun thing with this mod is that Jack just straight up fucking shoots the Pokemon in the head, rather than getting into a battle with them. It's worth commending the effort that went into this fan project, as it's a 3 to 4 hour long game built from the ground up off RPG Maker, which I'd say makes it worth a shot if you're a fan of Pokemon and games like Resident Evil. Blank Dream is an RPG Maker game heavily focused on the main protagonist's attempt to end her own life. She wakes up in a place called the Mirror World, with no memories, and has to break any mirrors with her reflection to gain them back. Along the way she'll run into a few characters, each also in the realm due to dying in the real world. You can choose to help them find and break their mirrors as well, or not. What you end up doing will determine which of the 5 endings you receive. If you choose to help everyone you come across, you'll regain all your memories, and they will as well, and you'll be saved in the real world, as you're removed from the lake you tried to drown yourself in. In the worst ending, you repeat the same mistakes you made in real life, and succumb to the Mirror World. Like most other RPG Maker games on here, it's got a dark atmosphere and some light jump scares. Again, it's hard to talk gameplay wise about these, and especially the visual novels. Martha is Dead is a 2022 release, so I'm gonna cop out on it and keep it relatively spoiler free. The game is a psychological thriller that takes place in World War II Italy. In the game, your sister Martha dies, hence the title, and you need to both cope with the loss and find answers as to who's responsible. The game is full of twists and turns, and the story is much more complex than anything I can reasonably say about it here without spoiling it. The game itself is voiced fully in Italian and lets you explore the Italian countryside, and I gotta say, for an indie game, it looks quite nice. Lisa the Pointless is a fan-made sequel to the Lisa games. Sadly, I won't be able to go into much detail here as there's only one chapter out as of now, and the game is still in development. Although due to this, I'm going to keep spoilers to a minimum as it's not cancelled yet, just unreleased. And even then, there's really not that much to talk about. The game's first chapter, Mystics of Trash and Violence, primarily follows two characters, being Alex Churchland, a disgraced martial artist, and Joel Miller, a gunslinger. The two partner up and together embark on a journey to find a better place. Gameplay-wise, it's obviously very similar to the Lisa games, with the difference here being that it's a lot harder, with less save points and more difficult enemy encounters. If you're a fan of the Lisa games, it might be worth keeping an eye on updates for this one, as again, it isn't cancelled, it's just taking a while. So this entry introduced me to something new, and I doubt it'll be the last one on here, with this being that Underparty is a Riona game. Riona being a fetish for characters being hurt in sexual or sensual ways. There's more to it, but that's all you've really got to know for now. Anyways, the game itself is an action platformer and is very light on plot. The reason I assume it's on here is because of what I mentioned earlier, as this game has a lot of violence and harm befalling the protagonist, with basically every hit in this game knocking you around or just killing you. Also, the game's intro comic literally has the character browsing RionaNet, in case you were doubtful. Amy is a 2012 survival horror game released exclusively for 7th gen consoles, and has a woman named Lana protecting a young girl named Amy in a zombie apocalypse. As Amy is immune to the virus and even has curing abilities, you need to protect her from zombies, the military, and more, with the end goal of getting Amy to a group of city doctors. In the game, Lana is infected, and as mentioned previously, Amy can heal her. While she's healed, things play out normally, but if Lana progresses into further stages of the disease, a pretty cool mechanic occurs where zombies will stop attacking you. The game was critically panned, and again, unless you want to dust off the old Xbox 360, you can't really play this one at the drop of a hat, so I'd say don't bother checking it out. It had some unique ideas, but kinda sucks. IGN is pretty famous for giving at the very lowest maybe a 4 or a 5, and they gave this a fucking 2, which says a lot. Yume Tuki is a big fan collaboration successor to Yume Nikki, which is constantly having content added to it over time. This might be one of the biggest projects on this entire Iceberg, and it has so much shit in it that it would be impossible to sum it up. This one straight up could be, and likely is, an Iceberg on its own, so I'm just going to talk about what it is rather than what's in it. Like Yume Nikki, the game has you exploring various dream worlds, and has events, effects for your character, and various puzzles to solve. There are dozens, if not hundreds of different maps, with each usually having surreal or generally weird visuals. Really, most things said about Yume Nikki can be said about this, but on a bigger scale. The game even has an online side project simply called Yume Tuki Online, which you can play straight from a browser with no sign up or anything. Really, if you want to know more about Yume Tuki, the best you could do is just hop on and try it. Hell, if you're an RPG Maker developer watching this, they're open to anyone joining and adding things, so like fuck it. Sign up and add something cool if you're up for it, why not? Heart of Darkness is a 1998 platformer about a boy named Andy going off on an adventure to find his dog after he's sucked away by otherworldly forces. He hops in his homemade rocket ship and journeys to Darkland, the world holding his dog. After exploring and adventuring for a while, Andy teams up with a character named Vicious Servant in order to shut down a black hole and take down the Master of Darkness, who's holding his dog captive. Upon arrival, the servant betrays Andy and kicks his dog into the black hole. After a scuffle, Andy and the Master of Darkness both fall into the black hole as well. They end up in a place called the Heart of Darkness, and as Andy is afraid of the dark, he not only needs to fight the Master of Darkness, but his own fears as well. Upon defeating the Master and closing the black hole, Andy and his dog wake up in his treehouse, implying that the whole game was a dream. But Andy's gotten over his fear of the dark. Gameplay-wise, it's aged pretty poorly and is a very hard game, but graphically the game has some beautiful 2D animation that I'd say still holds up even today, as well as some terribly aged but charming 90s CGI. If I were a betting man, I'd wager this game is mostly on here due to the numerous death scenes, which aren't bloody, just violent, especially considering you're playing as a little kid in the game. Andy can get absolutely destroyed in this game, getting his spine broken, getting ripped apart, getting eaten, getting crushed, and plenty more. For a bit of context on this one, Clive Barker is primarily a movie and book guy, most well known for being responsible for Hellraiser, among other works. But really, the man's done everything, including comics, TV, visual arts, and even a few video games. Clive Barker was notably involved in 5 major games, and you'll know he's involved because the fucking guy slapped his name onto the front of all of these games. Briefly going over them, Clive worked on 2 separate versions of an adaptation of a movie he wrote and directed in 1990 called Nightbreed. One game being Clive Barker's Nightbreed, the action game, and the other being Clive Barker's Nightbreed, the interactive movie. These 2 are kind of throwaway and are more movie tie-in cash grabs. Clive's first real foray into video games came with 2001's Clive Barker's Undying, a first-person horror shooter developed and published by EA. The game is set in the 20s and has a paranormal investigator investigate various occult happenings at his buddy's house. It got actually pretty good reviews and seems solid. It also sold like absolute shit, and EA completely shelved anything to do with the game. Clive's 4th game, Clive Barker's Demonic, was cancelled mid-development. It was supposed to be a tie-in game for a movie of the same name, also by Clive, but as the movie was cancelled, so was the game. The final game to date Clive has had any real involvement in is with Clive Barker's Jericho. Like Undying, the game is a horror FPS and released in 2007. The game has you playing as 7 members of the Department of Occult Warfare, codenamed Jericho, in their mission to stop a god-equivalent being named the Firstborn from being unleashed onto the Earth. It's a cool concept, but apparently the game itself kinda sucks, with it reviewing much worse than Clive Barker's Undying. One thing it has in common with Undying is sales numbers, with Jericho also selling pretty badly. Now this is complete speculation, based on nothing, but with the negative reviews of Jericho along with the poor sales of both games, Clive probably is done for good with video games, unless he wants to work on some smaller scale projects. As a bonus, I've read a bit about a few other games with his name attached, such as Hell Online, which is based on Hellraiser, but Clive either refused to comment on them or straight up said he had no involvement. Frequently described as a spiritual successor to the Clock Tower games, Haunting Ground is a relatively forgotten survival horror, and one by motherfucking Capcom at that. The game follows Fiona Bell, a young woman who, after being involved in a car crash, awakens in a cell beneath a castle. It's unlocked, so she just kinda dips, but runs into a dog she befriends named Huey. The rest of the game has you trying to escape the castle, while running into a few goons along the way. There's some lore dumps about Fiona being able to rebirth people, which essentially lets them live forever, but it doesn't really matter since you murk everyone and just leave the castle with your iconic dog. Depending on your actions, some variation in the ending is possible, but it's nothing major. On New Game Plus, if you had previously befriended a certain character, you can just fucking leave the castle early on in the game, which is hilarious. More games should do secret endings like that. Also, side note, I gotta say, this game has some pretty nice graphics for PS2. Granted, it was released near the end of its life cycle, and it's by Capcom, but still. Uncanny Valley is a 2015 survival horror game taking place in an abandoned factory that you're working the night shift at as security. Since the job is so boring, you begin to wander around and explore the factory, uncovering all kinds of odd things. You also have nightmares about your past, which involves you witnessing a murder. The murder in question is what caused you to flee out to the countryside and take up the job as security at the factory, as the gang is after you for being a loose end. The game takes place over 5 days, and on the 5th day, gangsters show up to kill you. There's a bunch of endings depending on when you choose to leave, or if you choose to stay, along with how much you've explored. If you don't really do anything and just wait for 5 nights, the gangsters show up and kill you. If you leave on the first day, the gangsters never end up finding you and die in a car wreck. Now if you've done some exploring, you'll have discovered that the factory houses some not so nice androids. The one android, Eve, doesn't want you getting out, at all, but she also doesn't want you dead. If you're caught trying to leave by Eve, she ties you up, cuts off all your limbs and cauterizes the wounds, leaving you helpless as she keeps you alive in the factory basement. Since there's 5 nights and multiple factors at play, there's a bunch of endings I didn't go over, so watch her to give it a try yourself if you want to see the rest. Rule of Rose is a 2006 survival horror game about a series of childhood traumas told in non-chronological order. I mentioned earlier that No One Lives Under the Lighthouse was a game open to interpretation, and this is no different. I'm going to take a second here to say that from around this tier and below, a lot more of these games aren't going to be set-in-stone narratives. We're going to see a lot more games that have interpretive narratives, and I'll try to mention it when I can. Be warned that since I can't play literally every game on here, since that would take way too long, I'm probably not going to be able to offer much in terms of my own interpretations. But if possible, I'll point you in the right direction of people more qualified than I to speak on them. For this one, I'd recommend watching Tark's Gauntlet's explanation video. It's about 10 minutes long if you'd like an interpretation of the chronological series of events. For a brief explanation here, The game has you playing as a young woman named Jennifer, becoming trapped in a world run by a group of children called the Red Crown Aristocrats. Throughout her journey, she pieces together various memories about her role in the world of the aristocrats. Gameplay-wise, it's really not the best, with the gameplay being pretty critically panned compared to the story. It's worth noting that the game got banned in the UK for actually made-up reasons, being that it was said that the game had suggestive scenes with the underage characters, which is just blatantly false, like that's not true, and that there was a bunch of violence towards children in the game, which also just isn't true. For these same made-up reasons, the game also got completely banned in all of Europe, but luckily they backtracked on that. The Seventh Guest is an early 90s interactive movie puzzle game that, as a bit of history, was one of the first games ever to only be released on CD-ROM. The game has you, Ego, wake up in a mansion with amnesia. While exploring the mansion, you have various ghostly visions of past events that took place in the mansion, where 6 guests were gathered inside to help find the 7th guest, a young boy named Tad, who is somewhere in the house. Over the course of the game, you solve a shit ton of puzzles and watch more past events play out until you reach the ending, where one of the guests has brought Tad to the attic, where the owner of the mansion awaits. It's revealed that the owner made a pact with an evil entity that needs Tad's soul to complete, and doubly reveals that the player's character Ego is Tad's spirit, who's being forced to relive these events over and over after the evil entity does end up taking his soul. After this revelation, Ego finds that he can now intervene in the past events and saves Tad. Ego then disappears into a ball of light.
Change the world. My final message. Goodbye.
From the same creators Watanohara, Mogeko Castle is another RPG Maker game, which was released in 2012 with a remake in 2014. The game has a young girl named Yonaka fall asleep on a bus ride home, waking up at an odd stop she'd never been to before. She gets off just to check it out, and encounters a group of cat people called Mogeko, who are very interested in high school girls. In a odd, creepy, you know where I'm going with this kind of way. She makes a break for the nearby castle, Mogeko Castle, to escape from them, and the game really starts. From here on, Yonaka can encounter various Mogeko, some friendly, some not, as she travels through the 7 floors of Mogeko Castle. The game has 10 endings, which would take way too long to go over, so I'll cover a few. The Everlasting Dream ending has Yonaka getting swarmed by Mogekos in the intro, after not deciding to enter the castle, leading to her getting given grape juice in a gang manner until she dies. In the fictitious Truth ending, Yonaka is stabbed a bunch by her brother, and in the Yonaka Castle ending, she scalps King Mogeko and wears his scalp like a hat and takes over, naming the castle after herself. There are multiple theories around this game, with none being the definitive true story, so I'd recommend playing through it and interpreting it your own way if you're interested. Overall, the game is much more open to interpretation story-wise compared to WoD. I've seen a couple analyses of the game, and both are pages upon pages long with different interpretations of various events in the story, so it'd be pretty difficult to go over it completely here. Luna Game is a series of short and simple platformers released in the early 2010s, during the height of the MLP and Brony internet presence. The first game mysteriously dropped on the fan site Equestria Daily, and had you playing as a character from the show named Princess Luna. The game is presented as a simple platformer where you can progress by moving forward through a basic level. After a short while, and I mean really short, like 20 seconds, the game jump scares you with one of 2 edited stills of a character from the show made to look 2011 scary. The game also becomes impossible to close at this point, outside of Task Manager or waiting a minute or 2 for the game to close itself. Once it is closed though, wherever the game was saved to will be completely flooded with text and image files saying the end is nay. Oh my god. The rest of the games follow similar but more elaborate formats, and there's a shit ton of them, so I'd recommend checking out the Izzy's video on the subject if you want the full experience of Luna Game, as she goes over the full history of the games. Grezzo 2 is a total conversion mod for Doom 2 released in 2012, which features a pagan farmer named Piero murking a bunch of Christian figureheads like Jesus, God, and the Virgin Mary, who he bursts out of and plays the guitar. The game also makes fun of a bunch of different Italian celebrities and religious figureheads, but I'm not an Italian in 2012, so I can't really explain any of it, since I don't get it. I'll end this one on the note that the game received enough attention to be put on Twitch's prohibited games list, which is quite a feat for a Doom mod. The game sparked a lot of controversy with a lot of Italian figureheads talking about it, and overall is probably the most controversial Doom mod ever created, at least in the mainstream. Buckle up, cause this is going to be a long one. Harvester is one of the weirdest FMV games ever created, releasing in 1996 during the height of the video games cause violence panic. The story begins with the main character, Steve, waking up in his room. He has amnesia and can't remember a single thing about his life or anyone around him. He walks into his living room to find his little brother watching TV and his mother in the kitchen. From this, we learn that Steve is a man from the 90s living in the 1950s, as he has vague memories of things from the future, but he can't quite put his finger on them, such as TV remotes. Steve is told various things about himself, including that he has a fiancée named Stephanie. Upon saying that he genuinely doesn't remember any of this, he's consistently met with the phrase, "You always were a kidder, Steve."
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.
You always were a kidder, Steve.
Well, you always were such a kidder, Steve.
You've always been a kidder, Steve.
Well, you always were a kidder, Steve.
From there, Steve's basic goal is to go around town interacting with the residents of Harvest, which is the game's setting. The overall goal is for Steve to get himself into the Lodge, a mysterious building located in the dead center of town. Upon heading to the Lodge, Steve is met with a sergeant of arms, who speaks with Steve telepathically about initiation. From here, Steve has to indulge in a series of progressively fucked up tasks. It starts simple, with things like keying a prized car or stealing a barber pole, eventually escalating into committing arson and burning down a diner. Each of these requests have unintended but severe consequences, such as the barber getting electrocuted when he turns on the lights, or the diner's owner, Edna, and her daughter becoming the crooked men. Her daughter is a young child, by the way, who was earlier in the story buried alive by your fiancé's father. Along the way, you'll meet all kinds of weird characters, such as Sheriff Dwayne.
All in all, I'd say this was death by natural causes.
Natural causes?
You can't live without a spinal cord, son.
Some of these encounters are even optional, such as Colonel Buster Monroe, a lower torso-less man in charge of the nuclear missile base.
Halt! Who goes there?
They tell me my name is Steve.
All right. This is Section 21. Keep your distance, son. I wouldn't want to have to blow your head off.
Oh, and we've got to show off the save screen. Back on topic, upon gaining Lodge membership, the game kinda loses focus, becoming more combat based. And let me tell you, the combat in this game is fucking terrible. The game just kinda throws a bunch of weird and disturbing things at you with no cohesion or structure until you reach the very end, such as fighting a gladiator, naked Elvis eating a bunch of burgers, and a mother being eaten alive by your children, with actual child actors playing the parts, I may add. In the very end, you find Stephanie, and the Sergeant of Arms reveals that Harvest is all a simulation. You have the choice to kill Stephanie and return to the real world, or to spare her and live out the rest of your lives in Harvest. I also forgot to mention that Stephanie is the only other real person here besides you. If you do choose to kill her, Steve Mortal Kombat rips out her spine and returns to the real world, becoming a sick fuck thanks to these events. A decently known bit of trivia about the game is that Steve's live-action actor, not voice actor, was arrested for possession of CP, so fuck him. There's so much to talk about with this game that I didn't even go over, such as what happens when you type fuck to your virtual mother, but we'd be here all day if I went over everything. This game is an absolute fever dream, and for some reason I can't get enough of it, especially that shitty mid-90s CGI, but we've got to move on now. This is one where I'm really not sure why it's this low, as it's a fairly popular game with over 8,000 reviews on Steam. For reference, some of the games in this tier have like 60 reviews. With that said, it's not my Iceberg and I'm still going to talk about it, just less in-depth than some of these others on the tier. Oxenfree is a 2016 supernatural side-scroller, which has a sequel slated to release in 2023 called Oxenfree 2 Lost Signals. The game has a group of teens take a ferry to an island housing an ex-military base for a weekend of partying. The island is rumored to have all kinds of supernatural occurrences, and after messing around with a radio, the gang opens up a bunch of supernatural rifts. The game is notable for not having any way to really lose. Instead, any actions, be it mistakes or purposeful, will affect the endings and overall outcomes of the game. The Cat Lady is a very story-driven psychological horror game, which focuses primarily on the main character taking her own life. After doing so, she encounters a character named the Queen of Maggots, who grants her immortality and gives her the task to eliminate 5 people, who are referred to as parasites. Over the course of the game, the main character, Susan, gets kidnapped like 3 times, each time by one or more of the parasites. She's first kidnapped by a doctor at the hospital she wakes up at, and she kills him after finding out that he makes artwork out of the bodies of his female patients. Susan returns home after this office and meets her new roommate, Mitzi. Mitzi has terminal cancer, and her late boyfriend used some toxic gas on himself and died after an online troll named Adam persuaded him into doing so. After a bit, Susan plays her piano, which she uses to summon neighborhood cats. Her neighbor calls pest control, and the pest control guy ends up kidnapping Susan. She awakens tied up to a table, and it's revealed that the pest control guy and his wife are cannibals. They pour bleach onto Susan's face, blinding her, and give her a gun to do the deed herself before eating her. Upon death, Susan's immortality regenerates her sight and bullet wound, and she kills the couple with the gun and escapes. After returning home, an intruder breaks in and ties up Susan and Mitzi in the bathroom. Susan opens up to Mitzi about her past during this time. She formerly had a daughter and husband, but partially due to her own actions, they both wound up dead. After this recollection, the intruder gets Susan to play the piano, and the neighborhood cats she ends up summoning kill the intruder. The final parasite left for Susan is the man named Adam, who was responsible for the death of Mitzi's boyfriend. When you find him, he's wheelchair-bound and completely paralyzed, only being able to move his left eye, which controls a keyboard that he uses to type. From here, there's multiple options on what to do with him, including letting Mitzi kill him, or talking her down and simply shutting off Adam's computer so that he can't cause the same thing to happen to anyone else. The ending of the game has Susan beginning to open up more about her problems, starting a blog about her journey. This one was super long because it's heavily story focused, but the game's art can't be discounted either, as it has a very grimy hand-drawn style that really adds to the overall atmosphere. Gameplay wise, the only controls you have are the arrow keys, which move you from left to right and let you interact with things. That's really all there is to the cat lady, so let's move on to the next entry. Lone Survivor is a survival horror game from 2012 by Jasper Byrne, who, as a fun fact, did a bunch of music for the Hotline Miami games. The game is a 2D side-scrolling survival horror that has you scavenging for supplies and avoiding mutants who have overrun the city. Along with this, you need to attempt to maintain your mental stability. The mutants in the game are attracted to both light and sound, so hiding in the shadows is the best way to get things done, as killing them lowers your mental state. As you can probably guess, mental state plays a pretty big role in the game, with you being able to find pills all over. This is to a point where pretty much the entire game's plot can be reasonably argued to be in the main character's head. But with that said, an expanded version of the game came out on Halloween of this year called Super Lone Survivor, so I'm not going to spoil it. Fear Effect is a PS1 action game from 2000 that had a sequel released a year later called Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix. Along with these, the series was picked back up 17 years later with a new entry called Fear Effect Sedna, and a remake of the first game is slated to release within the next year or two. I just want to say before we continue that I've seen way bigger franchises than this get way less love than it's getting from the developers. Starting off properly, this game has some crazy good graphics for the PlayStation 1, mostly thanks to its use of cel-shaded characters and FMV backgrounds. The trade-off here is that the game is split up into 4 fucking discs. The game takes place in 2050s Hong Kong and follows 3 protagonists, Hannah, Glass, and Deke. The trio are trying to track down a triad boss's daughter to hold for ransom, and begin searching around Hong Kong to find her. After a bit of searching, it turns out that the daughter is a sacrificial key to expand hell so that it will consume Earth. Quite a turn of events, I gotta say. Skipping forward to the end, only Hannah and Glass remain, and you have the option of picking which one lives, which will determine which of the 5 endings you get. The 5th ending can only be unlocked by sparing both of them, which is only available if you play on the hard difficulty. Gameplay wise, the game controls like classic Resident Evil games with tank controls. Although since this game is more action focused, you can shoot while moving, or shoot 2 guns at once. The game's health meter is a heartbeat sensor, which will pulse faster depending on how damaged you are. You can lower the rate at which it pulses by doing calming things like solving puzzles and getting stealth kills. The game isn't really scary or anything, as it's more of a crime story with some demons thrown in. I'd assume it's really only this low because it's very forgotten about. My Only is a Slender clone requiring you to collect 12 pages. It has a really pixelated art style, which is pretty cool looking. The game's plot has a man visiting his wife's grave, which he does every day. It's revealed through notes that you collect that he was the one that killed her by drowning her in a lake. I mentioned earlier that it was a Slender clone, and it is, with her spirit being the Slender Man equivalent in the game. Depending on what you do and what you find, a few different endings are possible, with pretty much all of them resulting in your death. RE77 or Re77 is an abandoned project that was heavily inspired by PT. I really can't say much more about this one besides that, as that's all it really has going for it, since it got abandoned very early in development. Lasagna Boy is basically a playable version of those I'm Sorry John creepy Garfield images in Game Boy videos, created and popularized by both William Burke and Lumpy Touch respectively, albeit without the copyrighted characters, which kinda defeats the purpose. The game goes on for way too long due to a lot of backtracking, but the classic version is free, so it's got that going for it at least. Alright, this is one where I don't know why it's on tier 4 to be honest. As far as I can tell, the most you can say about Red Orchestra 2 is that it's gritty and realistic, but that's about it. Other than that, it's a standard early 2010s FPS with over 20,000 reviews on Steam to boot. The game doesn't even have a single player anymore, as it was removed from the game, not for anything disturbing, but just for being shit. Still, if anyone has any experience with this one, for why it's disturbing or dark, let me know in the comments if there's something, hidden deep within the game or something that's long forgotten about. The Coma is a 2015 survival horror game, which was remastered in 2017. The game also has a sequel named The Coma 2 Vicious Sisters. The game takes place in a Korean high school named Sawa High. You end up falling asleep during the middle of an exam and awaken in an alternate version of the school called The Coma. As you wander around looking for a relic, which is your only way out, you're hunted by a creature that looks strikingly similar to your teacher. Also, you learn that your grades are dogshit, and obviously you've got to correct that too. The game itself is based on one of the developer's personal experiences with the Korean education system, and the extreme pressures it puts on young kids. I don't have time to fully talk about the absolutely toxic Korean education system, but know that generally, high grades and extreme amounts of time dedicated to studying are incredibly important. Now, I'm not an expert, and this may be generalizing, so feel free to correct me on this one if it's gotten better or if I'm dead wrong. But from what I've read, it's at the least a very mentally draining system. Hacknet is a hacking simulation game where you follow the tracks of a recently assassinated individual named Bit. It's reported on that his death was an accident, but following various trails you discover that his death was an accidental assassination instead. There's not too much to say about this one, as it's mostly just hackery stuff, so if you're into that, check it out. The game also has a DLC called Hacker Labyrinths, which is basically a new game altogether, so I'll forgo talking about it. One thing I did find cool about the DLC is that at one point your game crashes and won't reboot until you dig into your files on your actual computer and delete a specific file. The Suffering is a 2004 shooter which also had a sequel in 2005 called Suffering Ties That Bind. The first game has you locked up in a prison for killing your family, but you have no memory of this happening. A short while after, an earthquake hits the prison and a bunch of supernatural threats begin emerging. The rest of the game has you escaping from the prison, making moral choices along the way to determine which ending you get. The good ending has you remember that you didn't kill your family, but instead you were spared by the criminals that did it, while the bad ending has you remembering that you were the one to kill your family. There's also a neutral ending that only had you kill your wife by accident, with your 2 sons dying of other causes. No matter what ending though, you escape from the prison on a boat. I'm not really going to go into the sequel here, but one cool thing about it that wasn't and still isn't very common is that your save file on your memory card could be read, and the ending that you got in the first game would determine how the sequel begins. Free Ice Cream is a very short browser game where you're kidnapped by a peg-legged man giving away free ice cream. You need to cut yourself loose, stay out of sight, and escape his house. Along the way you encounter your friend who ended up being killed by the kidnapper, but in the end you do manage to escape. Thrill Kill was a cancelled 1998 fighting game from Paradox Development. The game was set to be the first 4-player 3D fighting game and featured very graphic and sexual imagery. This imagery was so intense that it caused the game to become one of the first adults-only rated games by the ESRB. And it wasn't rated AO for the sexual imagery, but for the violence. Although ultimately this was kind of pointless because of that little old cancellation thing. Fun fact, this game was originally in development as a fucking sports game, but their publisher kept pushing for it to be more violent, which led to the game becoming Thrill Kill. Ironically though, when their publisher changed to EA, they wouldn't allow for the game to be published thanks to the violence that their old publisher had pushed for. Nowadays you can find leaked builds of the game online, and while they're unfinished, they at least look decent for the time. With that said though, the game didn't completely go to waste, and was instead reskinned as Wu-Tang Shaolin style for the PS1. Sayana Uda is a visual novel which has a man named Fuminori left with a severe mental condition which leaves him seeing everything as meaty masses, including people. While in the hospital for treatment, he meets the only person who has looked normal to him so far, a girl named Saya. Outside of his vision, she's actually a horrific monster, and because of this mutual bond they have over this, they quickly connect and hook up. Later on, one of Fuminori's concerned friends come to visit him, and they're killed by Saya, as well as being eaten by both Saya and Fuminori. A short bit after this, Saya afflicts their neighbor with the same condition Fuminori has, and the neighbor proceeds to kill his entire family and give grape juice to Saya, and is then killed by Fuminori. From here there's a few branching paths leading to some different endings. One has Fuminori being cured, but Saya leaves as to not reveal her true true form to him, and after being cured, he's arrested and locked up. A few of the other endings involve making a choice as a character named Koji, who's investigating the two others. Depending on your choices, Saya can either end up transforming the world into the same kind of abomination as her, or Koji can get back up and kill her. If he does end up killing her, Fuminori murks himself as well, and due to the PTSD from the whole situation, Koji plans on doing the same thing. Oh, one last bit about this game, Saya is literally made to look like a fucking child, which makes everything about this game exponentially more fucked up, as I haven't even mentioned that it's also a Zorn game. Not okay. Popo and Yo has you playing as a 12-year-old boy named Kuiko, who finds himself in a dreamlike world after running into his closet trying to get away from his alcoholic father. Inside the dream you encounter a big fella named Monster. You're warned to stay away from him, but upon interaction he seems pretty chill, so you tag along with him exploring the dream world. Things go sour and your day becomes rotten when Monster eats a poisoned frog and becomes enraged, chasing Kuiko until you calm him down with an apple. This isn't the end of the game, but if you haven't already gotten it, Monster is a representation of Kuiko's father, with the poisoned frog being alcohol. The actual ending of the game has you tasked with finding a shaman to cure Monster of addiction to poisoned frogs. Upon finding the shaman, you're instead met with memories of Kuiko's father and what led to his alcoholism. A mysterious voice then tells Kuiko that there is no cure and that he needs to let him go. Blameless is a short puzzle game which has a freelance architect accept an offer to check over a house. Upon arrival, he notices a bloodstain on the floor of the garage, and when he goes to inform the owner of it, he gets knocked out. He awakens in the now locked garage and needs to escape, which is where the game really begins. As the house is still under construction, there are various tools and items which you can use to help aid your escape. The game is non-linear, and you have multiple different methods of getting out. Upon getting out of the garage and into the house proper, you can explore and look around for a way out. While looking around, you'll hear the owner dragging things, you'll find a dead body, and eventually, you'll run into the big man himself, who chases you to the front gate. Upon reaching it, 2 police cruisers pull up and they arrest you, after the owner somehow hides away. At the police station, it's revealed that the real owner of the house sold it 2 weeks ago, and the construction company working on it was away that day. They also say that they found your fingerprints on the body you found, and that no other people were spotted at the house that night, which results in you taking all the blame. Dormitibus is a Five Nights at Freddy's fan game which serves as an epilogue to the first 4 games in the regular series, not taking any games after Five Nights at Freddy's 4 into account. Also, despite being a fan game, it's longer than most of the games in the original series. I'll get it out of the way now rather than later. A remaster was planned for this game, updating models and gameplay in general, but it's since been cancelled after one of the main developers was allegedly exposed for being a child groomer or something of the sort. And that's all I'll really say on the matter because I couldn't find too much info on it. With that said, it was not a one-person show, and it would be a waste to not talk about this one at least a little bit, as a lot of hard work from others went into the project as well. The game takes place in Purgatory and features 10 nights, plus 2 bonus nights that serve as endings. The game features a variety of fucked up and mangled animatronics called Havoc animatronics, who are trying to kill you to become whole again. You're heavily implied to be playing as the protagonist from Five Nights at Freddy's 3, and after the 12 nights you manage to free yourself from Purgatory, as well as the spirits of the animatronics. After you beat the game, it transitions to the ending of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, where a locked box was shown with no way to open it. In Dormitibus' ending, the box is open and has newspapers detailing the events of the fan game. It's also worth noting that the game details the iconic purple guy giving grape juice and murdering a teenage girl, which was not in the originals, and it really has no plot relevance and was just thrown in there as a weird fetish thing, and you can probably guess which of the developers added that in. JFK Reloaded is a 2004 simulation game which has you playing the role of Lee Harvey Oswald in the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. You're rewarded with points based on the accuracy to the real shooting, and the company even offered a cash prize to the person to submit the most realistic clip. Though you would think the contest would likely get revoked or cancelled because of how fucked up it is, it didn't, and the contest ended when a 16-year-old boy claimed almost $11,000 in prize money. The game features multiple camera angles, realistic bullet simulation, and slow-motion replays of your shot afterwards. And overall, it's very accurate, as the devs spent several months researching. With that said, the game also lets you go on a full shooting spree, and doesn't limit you to just shooting JFK, which is pretty fucked up no matter what way you spin it. Ultimately though, the game had a ton of backlash from the general public, politicians, and even a spokesperson for JFK's brother Ted Kennedy, who called the game despicable. Remothered is a series of 2 games by Stormind Games. The series was supposed to be a trilogy, but the director, Chris Darrell, hated the second game and left the series. The first game, Remothered, Tormented Fathers, released in 2018, and the sequel, Remothered, Broken Porcelain, released in 2020. The first game is an homage to Clock Tower, and has you investigating the house of an old man named Richard Felton. His daughter, named Celeste, ran away from home over 20 years ago when you're looking for info. You get kicked out after you blow your cover, and return later at night to continue your search for answers. After this is a whole series of twists and turns, including the reveal that Celeste had previously returned home, but was imprisoned by her father, who thought she was another girl. A big pharmaceutical scandal is also brought up, in which your character was directly involved in burning to the ground, which they have no memory of. Near the end of the game, you get a clue as to where Celeste escaped to, and continue your search. Gameplay-wise, the game is third person and based around stealth. Like a few other games on here, if you're caught by anything, it's game over for you, as everything's a one-hit, unless you're carrying a weapon on you. Now, seeing as the director of the games hates the second game, as it was rewritten and rushed, I'll skim over it. It's both a prequel and a continuation, and has Celeste and the previous protagonist playable. It journeys the initial years of Celeste's escape from her father, as well as going as far as the death of the previous protagonist, who dies of Alzheimer's. It also got completely dogged on, averaging a 4 out of 10 review score. Again, this was supposed to be a trilogy, and a third game was planned, but the director of the games currently has no intention of making part 3. Silent Hill El Camilla is a total conversion mod for Half-Life 2. The game is exactly what you would expect based on this, being a fan-made Silent Hill game on the Source engine. The differences here are that there are no combat or enemies, it's primarily focused on puzzle solving, and it's in first person. The mod features an original story, with voice acting, music, and more, and is a pretty ambitious fan project altogether. The development team for this mod has also gone on to begin creating their own game called Twin Soul, which currently has a demo out. Fingerbones is a short horror game by David Szymanski, the creator of Dusk and Iron Lung, among others. The game is set in the post-apocalypse, with a father returning to the bunker he hid in with his daughter in the initial few weeks of the world ending. In the game, you collect notes recollecting what happened, ranging from the first few weeks to about a year after the apocalypse. The notes heavily imply that the father did some stuff with his daughter, saying that he had no reason to hold back any urges as he was potentially the last man on Earth, and he hasn't seen another woman in over a year. You then find a bunch of finger bones locked in a safe, and a later note reveals that when she ended up dying, he cut off her fingers and dumped her in the woods, locking her fingers in the safe. The game ends with your flashlight going out deep in the bunker, and the father sitting down to die. Red Candle Games is an indie studio founded in 2015 by 6 developers. They currently have 2 games released, with a third slated to release in 2023. For the purposes of this Iceberg, their third game is going to be an action game, so I'll skip talking about it. However, their other 2 games are more notable. Starting off with the first game, Detention is a psychological horror side-scroller set in 1960s Taiwan, which was under martial law at the time. The game has a girl named Ray rat out a banned book club at her school out of misplaced jealousy related to a former relationship she had. She thought this would simply get her teacher fired, but it ended up resulting in the execution of her classmates and fleeing of her teacher. The game is revealed to be a purgatory Ray is trapped in due to her jumping off a building out of guilt of what she did. She can choose to accept or deny the situation. Denying it will repeat the cycle, and accepting it leads to the true ending. The true ending has one of the classmates she ratted out returning to the school. It's revealed that he was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, and his journal reveals that the teacher that fled the country died of lung cancer before she could ever return. As he sits at his old desk, Ray's ghost sits across from him. Their second game, Devotion, came out in 2019 and is another psychological horror, with this one being first person. This one is set in 1980s Taiwan and is based on elements of Taiwanese culture and religion. Before we get into the plot, there was some controversy with this game, being that there was an Easter egg making fun of Xi Jinping, head of the CCP, in it. This caused the game to be pulled from shelves and banned in China, and this all escalated to a point where Taiwan's vice premier had to speak out in defense of the game, saying that free and democratic countries have the right to include such material. In 2020, the game was slated to release on GOG, but they backtracked out of it over backlash from either the Chinese government or general Chinese audiences. Overall, a pretty fucked up situation that Red Candle is completely in the right for. Back to the actual game, Devotion's plot has a family falling apart due to religious fanaticism. A young daughter wants to be a singer, but is falling ill. A doctor recommends psychiatric care, but her father, who recently began following a cult mentor, refuses. The mother gets fed up with his downward spiral, refusal to help his daughter, an inability to stop listening to the cult, and she leaves. At this point, it becomes clear that the father has become an absolute, complete fanatic for the cult. Eventually, he submerges his daughter in rice wine in the bathtub and locks her in the bathroom for 7 days, presumably killing her, all based on advice from his cult mentor. The game ends with him watching white noise on the TV. Hylix 1 and 2 are two of the most visually unique games ever created, as I'm sure you can tell just by looking at them even for a few seconds. The games were created by Mason Lindroth and the soundtrack by Chuck Salamone and Lindroth. A third game is also in development, likely just called Hylix 3. The games themselves are odd and surreal RPGs, with graphics made from sculpted clay scanned into 3D models, giving everything a really gooey and weird look. The games have you playing as Wayne, a leather-clad dude with a waning moon head. In the first game, you and a crew are traveling to the moon to meet Gibby, King of the Moon. It's filled with surrealism and symbolism, and is very light on direct storytelling. The second game has you and a crew trying to prevent Gibby's resurrection. After defeating Gibby post-resurrection, your gaggle gets on stage and plays a little song. If you plan on checking out Hylix, and you start with the first one, fair warning that the plot will likely be incomprehensible, as most of the dialogue is literally randomly generated, including the final bosses, but in a way that's part of the charm. The second game has actual written dialogue, but it's written in such an odd and weird way that you'll also likely be left scratching your head. This doesn't make the games bad, but if you're playing them, your focus should be more on the unique art style and visuals, as well as the banger soundtrack. Alright, so for the house in Fata Morgana, I was planning to do a plot recap, but that would take way too long for this Iceberg, so I'll keep it brief instead. The game has you playing as an amnesiac spirit, trying to recover its memories by going back in time to various points in history. The game is all about past and future lives, reincarnation, and immortality. Along with this, the game has things like mutilation for harvesting blood, child abuse, incest, grape juice, murder, and more. Again, this is a bare-bones summary because the game is very long and intricate. I'd recommend looking into this one yourself if you're a visual novel fan, as it has overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. Before capping this one off, it's also definitely worth mentioning the companion game, Fata Morgana, A Requiem for Innocence. The game serves as a prequel that expands on the story of a few characters from the original, and has been similarly well regarded. Pokemon Reborn is another RPG Maker fan game, with this one being more in line with the main series, except that it's exponentially more difficult. The game itself also has no qualms with straight up murking both Pokemon and people, which I'm pretty fucking certain also doesn't happen in the base games. The game is both episodic and has had a bunch of revisions to the story, as well as updates over the years, along with being generally pretty long, so a story explanation is kind of off the table here. But I can note that the game begins with a fucking act of terror in a Pokemon game. I'll also say that the plot is based around and follows the actions of a real-life role-playing group, which is now defunct, called the Pokemon Reborn League. The characters in-game, like gym leaders and rivals, are based on real characters played by various members of the group, and there's been some controversy about the mod exploiting the possible personal traumas of some members to use as plotlines in the story. With that said, I'm really not even sure if this even holds up, because this is some like half a decade old drama at this point, so go into that at your own volition, if you can find anything on it. This entry is similar to Yume Tuki in that it's simply too big to give a good enough explanation for without it taking up a decent chunk of the video. I think this will be the last huge fan game on here, so we hopefully shouldn't run into this problem again. Claire released in 2014 with an extended version releasing in 2016. The game is a side-scroller, with the main character exploring an evil version of the hospital her mother is staying at. Along the way, you'll collect notes and observe the visual storytelling to get a better idea of the overall narrative. The game's atmosphere has been frequently described as a 2D version of the Silent Hill games, being very dark and set in spooky versions of everyday locations. Throughout the handful of different environments are monsters, which Claire has no way to fight back against, meaning your only method of defense in the game is hiding or booking it. The game has 6 different endings depending on your actions throughout the game, but pretty much all of the endings, and the whole story for that matter, is up to the player's interpretation, based on hints given to you throughout the game. You and Me and Her released in Japan in 2013, with an English translation releasing in 2020. The game's plot is split up into a few different sections. The first has you trying to rekindle a bond with your old childhood friend, Miyuki, and also trying to help a socially awkward girl named Aoi become more socially active. Over the course of this first part, a bit of a love triangle develops between the three of you, but Aoi, knowing she's in a video game, makes a call to God to patch the game so that only you and Miyuki will be together. After this, Aoi adopts a cat she finds and disappears for a few days. When she reappears, she tells the protagonist to confess his love for Miyuki. He does, and after a bit of time, the two are in a relationship of eternal love, and Aoi vanishes from existence. After you complete the first part, an Aoi route opens up, where instead you end up in a relationship with her. After some revelations that she's cheating on you, an intervention is staged at your birthday party, where you'll confront both Aoi and her other lover. Upon confrontation, Aoi reveals that she's a visual novel NPC who essentially needs to have Zex in order to survive, and you need to participate in a 3-way to keep her alive. Unbeknownst to the three of you, Miyuki was hiding under the bed the whole time. She ends ends up going downstairs, and when you find her, she's covered in blood from baseball batting the cat Aoi adopted, and she doesn't plan on stopping there. After killing Aoi, Miyuki directly addresses the player, saying that they fucked up everything by doing the Aoi route, after being forced into eternal love with Miyuki during the first route. After she busts your balls in with a baseball bat, she also calls God and requests another rewrite, which closes the game. The next time you start up the game, Act 2 will have officially started. In this route, you're eternally trapped interacting with, and only with, Miyuki. While making dinner for her, you drug her, and now you get to call God. In this call, you bring Aoi back and are forced to choose your ending. However, whether you pick Miyuki or Aoi, the result is the same. Aoi and the player are forcefully evicted from reality, disappearing from existence and memory. Just as a side note for this entry, there was some stuff skimmed over in the plot, and as an aside, I'm not really 100% certain on how to summarize the visual novels, so some will be general plot recaps like this, and others are just going to be brief rundowns, like a few we've done earlier. Illbleed is a Sega Dreamcast survival horror game released back in 2001. The game parodies horror B-movies, putting you through 6 different movie-styled sets. The plot has your friends invite you to check out the new horror theme park, Illbleed, as a $100 million reward is offered to anyone who can get through the whole thing. At first you decline the offer because it sounds like a marketing scheme, but when your friends don't return, you're forced to investigate. After getting through the whole thing, there's a few different endings based on which friends you save along the way. If you save all or most of your friends, you get the money and get out. However, if you don't save anyone, you get the true ending, where it's revealed that the creator of the theme park is your estranged father, who created it solely to scare you. Then he fucking dies. If you're looking for a traditional survival horror game, this won't be it. The game is more comedy horror than anything. It's trying to replicate the feel of going to a haunted house, being that you need to avoid traps, avoid scares like flickering lights, and avoid employees chasing you. The game is super campy and fully leans into that, which makes it stand out among others in this genre. So I want to start this one off by saying I've been seeing a lot of hype for this one in the comments, and I can say that it was Euphoria has you, Kaisuke, and a group of girls wake up in a white room with no info on how they got there. A voice tells the group that they're being forced to participate in a game, or they'll be killed. After hearing what the game is, one girl lashes out and refuses, resulting in her being eliminated, which results in a very graphic and brutal death. The protagonist, Kaisuke, is aroused by this, discovering that he's a sadist, but is then blackmailed by one of the girls once she finds out about this. As for what the game within the game is, Kaisuke is forced to give grape juice to and torture each of the girls in the room. And with that, I'm going to cop out and end this one prematurely, because it would mostly consist of grape juice, poo-poo, piss, gore, and torture. The story itself is a lot deeper than just a guy locked in a room with 6 chicks he's got a bone, but the vast majority of the disturbing stuff comes with the aforementioned content. I'll briefly mention that there's a handful of the group that does end up escaping, and it's revealed that it was all some fucking Metal Gear Solid 2-esque simulation set up by the elite. Also, it's worth noting that it got an OVA adaptation, but I can't attest to the quality, because I'm not going to watch it. I just thought it was worth a mention. It Moves is an RPG Maker horror game based on the creepypasta Bedtime. The game is focused completely on atmospheric horror rather than jump scares, and has you playing as a kid who's piss his pants scared about going to bed. Throughout the game you solve puzzles in various dreamy settings, with creatures pursuing you, and along with this, possibly have someone in your bottom bunk as you sleep. The game features 7 different nightmares with 7 different environments, featuring different creatures and atmospheres in each. If you've got an hour to kill and are in the mood for a spooky game, it's free on Steam. Soldier of Fortune is a 2000 first-person shooter developed by Raven Software, who later went on to help develop entries in the Call of Duty series. The game had a few sequels, being Soldier of Fortune 2 Double Helix and Soldier of Fortune Payback. Payback doesn't matter to this Iceberg, so forget it exists, but the first 2 are on here 100% because of their unrivaled gore systems. The first and second games feature 2 of the most in-depth gore systems possible for the time, letting you blow off arms, legs, heads, and more. The first game even features a fucking microwave gun that just explodes people into little giblets. Fun fact about the gore system is that it created such a stir that the Canucks registered the game as a restricted rated film, and the Germans listed it on the Federal Department for Media Harmful to Young Persons. Kitty Horror Show is a developer who specializes in 90s-looking psychological horror games. Essentially, she was way ahead of the somewhat recent boom in PS1-styled horror games, with her earliest complete game, Dust City, releasing in 2014. She has a bunch of games out, including a collection of collections of games called Haunted Cities, so it would take up way too much time to go over everything here. The basics of what you need to know getting into Kitty Horror Show is that the games aren't based on traditional horror, so you're not going to run into any jump scares. The game's looks are primarily based on looking like they're from the early to mid 90s, and most of the games involve heavy subject matter. Most of our games are free to try out, so check them out in your own time if these sound interesting. One of the bigger mods for Half-Life 1, Half-Life Echoes takes place concurrently to the base game, similarly to the Blue Shift and Opposing Force expansion packs. You play as a character named Candidate 12, who needs to fight for survival after the Resonance Cascade sets the Half-Life series in motion. The game is much more survival and horror focused compared to the base game, with puzzles, ammo, and health being scarce. To put things in perspective, for most of the mod, the most you'll have is a crowbar, pistol, and shotgun, while the base Half-Life 1 has 14 different weapons. Overall, the mod is just a bleaker version of the main series, but that's what sets it apart and makes it a unique experience worth playing if you enjoy Half-Life. A 1992 psychological horror point-and-click adventure, Dark Seed is most notable for using H.R. Geiger's artwork within the game, and for being one of the first games available in a high resolution at the time. The game has you getting an alien slugged into your head during a nightmare. You wake up with a wicked headache, and in your next dream you learn that it was real. It's real. And that if you don't get the embryo, known as the Dark Seed, out of your head, all of humanity will die. The next day you solve the issue and everything is fine. A sequel was released a few months later in '95, but they lost the lead designer and Geiger's involvement, so it's really not worth talking about beyond a mention. Scorn is a very recent release as of writing, being a first-person horror adventure game. The reason I placed it here is because it's another game heavily based on H.R. Geiger's artwork, except Scorn is completely without his involvement because, well, you know, he's dead. Since it's so new, I'll avoid spoilers, and since it's a bonus entry, it doesn't get a full explanation, but if there's one thing I can say about this game, it's that it's visually stunning. The Thing is a 2002 game that's both based on and also serves as a canonical sequel to the 1982 film of the same name. The game has you playing as the captain of a spec ops team sent into the research base from the film to determine what happened. Taking a moment here to explain the Thing, since this isn't the first time on the Iceberg I've mentioned it, the movie is set in an Antarctic research base where an alien has gotten loose that can impersonate living beings perfectly, including animals. The movie has the main cast slowly picked off by the Thing, which impersonates different members. Its weakness is found out by Kurt Russell Gaming, with the Thing being weak to fire. It's an awesome movie, and you should definitely watch it if you've never seen it. Back to the game, one of the standout elements is the trust system. You need to prove to your squad mates that you're not infected, and vice versa. You can only do this by using moderately rare test kits, and if you can't test yourself, your crewmates will likely refuse to work with you. If you can't test them, they could turn into a monster at any second. The game also features a fear system for companions, which occurs in 3 tiers. At tier 1, they're fine, chill even. At tier 2, they're pissing their pants a little, and by tier 3, they're absolutely broken and try to kill you, your squad mates, or themselves. Besides the cool squad mechanics, it's a pretty standard survival horror game that essentially just becomes purely an action game at some points. If you can get it working on modern systems, the game is pretty cool. Fun fact, in the game, the character Sean Faraday is voiced by the film's director, John Carpenter. Oh, and motherfucking Kurt Russell Gaming shows up in the end too. Back at the end of tier 3 I talked about worlds.com. And one thing I neglected to mention was that there was a Japanese version of the client called Worlds Chat J, or Worlds Chat Japan. It was brought into existence by a Japanese company and launched in 1996, and even had fucking voice chat, which is pretty insane for the time. What I really put this one on here for, though, is the absolute jock jams that this version has, that I think about 10 people total have listened to in the last 20 years. I'm going to throw a link in the description to a site that goes over more history, as well as containing an archived download for the program, should you want to try it yourself. Dream of the Blood Moon is a 2013 indie horror game, which has you walk through a foggy forest, searching for blue tears while avoiding a ghost chasing you. Obviously, releasing in 2013, the game is riding the coattails of Slender, being very similar in style. Once you've collected all the blue tears, you bring them to a body strung up on a tree, and free the soul of the ghost chasing you. In the end, it's revealed that it was all a dream. Or was it? 1916 Der Unbekannte Krieg is a 2011 freeware horror game set in World War I. The game has you playing as a German soldier, trying to fight and stay alive within the trenches of the German front lines. There's one major problem though, besides the mustard gas, bombs, soldiers, and overall situation, being that dinosaurs have also entered the trenches, adding another layer onto this already massive pile of shit situation you're in. The game ends with you managing to get yourself out of the trenches, but still getting killed anyway, because you ran right into no man's land. The entire game is in German, besides the controls, meaning that unless you understand German, you're kinda shit out of luck in terms of understanding what's going on. With all this said, it's free and under half an hour long, so try it out if you want. Tale of Tales is a development group consisting of a couple very artsy artists. The duo was active for a decent while, starting all the way back in 2002, releasing a multitude of games over their lifespan. However, the release of their game Sunset in 2015 was met with pretty shitty sales, so they called it quits. Going over a few of their noteworthy games that you might have heard of before. The Graveyard is a very short game in which you play as a granny that walks through a graveyard, sits on a bench, and fucking dies. The Endless Forest is a game where you play as some fucking weird looking deer in a forest doing some deer stuff. One more I'll mention on here is The Path, which is probably their most famous game, and also one of their only true horror games. The Path is a psychological horror game set in the woods, and is based on Little Red Riding Hood. You can choose one of 6 different girls to play as, and then choose to stay on the path to your grandmother's house, or to stray off, where you're likely to encounter wolves. This development studio is at the very least interesting to look back on, but I can't spend a super long amount of time on them, so I'd recommend checking out the Izzy's video on The Path, where she goes more in depth on the game and a bit on the studio as well. Devil's Tuning Fork is a game which uses a sort of sonar or echolocation mechanic for its visuals. The game's plot has a mysterious disease caused children across the globe to fall into comas, which includes you. Only being able to see by using your tuning fork to highlight an area with sound waves, you need to figure out what's causing the epidemic, and also need to save the other children. There's nothing insanely scary or dark about this game, but it's very ominous. Super Mario Dollar is a fan project that is a progressively fucked up Mario game. It starts out as a regular Mario platformer, fighting Goombas and Piranha Plants, but quickly gets creepy, having you fighting creepy Luigi as the final boss. The ending reveals that it was all a dream, Luigi is dead for real, and Mario visits his grave to drop off some flowers. One cool thing with this fan game is that to get the worst ending, you need to hack the game to allow Mario to move off the title screen. After doing so, walking off the screen will give you the worst ending. Nothing ever hints at this being a thing, and I'm surprised anyone found it. Drowned God is a really weird game from 1996, being based on a manuscript written by Harry Horse. The game is absolutely filled with that signature 1990s CGI weirdness. This doesn't have to do with anything, I just really like this style. The game is centered around various conspiracy theories, with the main one being that human history is all made up bullshit and aliens are behind it all. You go through different worlds collecting artifacts. These worlds are places like Stonehenge, Aztec ruins, and Area 51. After exploring all the areas, you're able to choose between 3 endings. One ends in a techno-police state, the second ends in a society forced into genetic manipulation, and the third has a group of chill aliens saying they'll arrive someday. The game is planned to get a sequel, as the lead, Harry Horse, said that the game's story was incomplete. The sequel, to be named Cult, was to be centered around Area 51. As in Drowned God, I didn't mention that you only really explore the outside of Area 51. Plans for this kind of went out the window in 2007, and I would recommend looking up what happened to Harry Horse in 2007, because I don't want to talk about it here. Penumbra Necrologue is a mod for Amnesia the Dark Descent that serves as a fan-made continuation of Penumbra Requiem, the expansion pack for Black Plague. The mod also got a sequel, or prequel rather, in Penumbra Twilight of the Archaic. So basically, this is a sequel to the sequel's sequel that also has a prequel. This is a total conversion mod and is a somewhat uncommon case of a mod becoming its own game on Steam, only requiring you to own Amnesia to play it. If you've played the Penumbra series and have Amnesia, this might be worth checking out, as it has a lot of heart and soul put into it by the developers, and it's free. Thanks for sticking around, fellas. I know I said this last time, but it's probably for real this time, being that I'll probably take a break after this tier. Tier 5 is even longer than this, and I'll need to add all the new entries from the 3rd version of the Iceberg, so I'll get started on something else in the meantime. If you've made it this far, and have something specific in mind for me to cover, which doesn't just have to be icebergs, feel free to give any suggestions in the comments. I'm really open to anything, be it internet history, spooky things, or otherwise. Anyways, I don't want to take up more of your time, so again, thanks for watching, and I'll probably have something else out soon.